Hello everyone, I am Ömer Burak İstanbullu from Eskişehir Osmangazi University. Today I will be presenting our work titled A Passive Compliance Sensing Smart Nitinol Stent for Early Detection of Restenosis in Peripheral Arteries. What I would like to do in this talk is not just introduce a device concept, but really walk you through the clinical gap, the underlying biomechanical rationale, and how we can leverage material physics rather than electronics to address a very persistent problem in vascular interventions. So to begin with, let's step back and look at the scale of the problem. Peripheral artery disease is already affecting a massive population, over 113 million people globally as of 2021. But more importantly, projections suggest that this number could exceed 360 million by 2050, which is roughly a 220% increase. Now, what makes this even more critical is the distribution. More than half of these patients are in low and middle income countries where access to advanced follow-up imaging is limited. So from the very beginning, any solution we propose ideally needs to be not only effective, but also scalable and cost optimized. Now, in terms of intervention, self-expanding nitinol stents are widely used and clinically well established, especially for coronary and femoral popliteal lesions. Mechanically, they perform quite well since they are flexible, fatigue resistant, and adaptable to vessel geometry. However, when we look at long-term outcomes, the picture changes. Primary patency drops dramatically over time, reaching around 29% at 10 years. So the issue is not the initial success of the procedure, it's the long-term biological response, specifically restenosis in our case. And this brings us to what I would describe as a fundamental surveillance gap. Currently, we do not have any system that continuously monitors the vessel after the stent implantation. Instead, restenosis is typically detected only after substantial lumen loss that has already occurred. So effectively, we are always observing the end-stage consequences, not the progression. And that's the key limitation if we aim for early intervention. If we briefly examine current surveillance methods, duplex ultrasound is the most common approach. It's relatively accessible but highly operator-dependent and inherently episodic. Computed tomography angiography and magnetic resonance angiography provide excellent anatomical resolution, but they are expensive, require contrast agents, and again, they only offer snapshot information. And then, of course, symptom reoccurrence, like claudication, represents very late-stage detection. So overall, all existing approaches share a common limitation. And they are intermittent, reactive, and not designed for continuous monitoring. Now, if we think about the disease progression itself, there is a clear temporal mismatch. Neointimal hyperplasia begins very early, within days to weeks after implantation. Then it progresses silently over several months without any noticeable symptoms. But clinically, we only detect it when lumen narrowing exceeds roughly 70%. So there is a significant delay between biological onset and clinical detection. So instead of focusing solely on flow limitation, we approach restenosis from a biomechanical perspective. As nointimal tissue accumulates, it doesn't just reduce the lumen, it also alters the mechanical properties of the vessel wall. Specifically, the vessel surrounding the stent becomes stiffer in time, and this leads to reduced arterial compliance, meaning the vessel's ability to expand and contract under pulsatile pressure diminishes. And this is really the key insight driving our work. Compliance loss occurs earlier than critical flow limitation. So before we see major hemodynamic changes, there is already a measurable biomechanical shift. Therefore, if we can monitor compliance continuously, we can potentially detect restenosis at a much earlier stage. To put this into context, let's compare it with fractional flow reserve or FFR. Well, this FFR term is a powerful tool, but it provides a single invasive hemodynamic snapshot. In contrast, our approach is non-invasive and focuses on longitudinal mechanical trends. So rather than asking what is the state right now, we are now asking how is the system evolving over time. Now, this is where nitinol becomes particularly interesting. Beyond its structural role, nitinol exhibits superelasticity. It can undergo reversible strains of up to about 8%. It also has exceptional fatigue resistance, tolerating hundreds of millions of loading cycles. So essentially, the stent is continuously deforming in response to arterial pulsation and doing so reliable over long periods. So the natural question is, can we use this inherent mechanical behavior as a sensing mechanism? Because the radial strain of the stent is directly influenced by the stiffness of the surrounding vessel. In other words, the stent is already mechanically coupled to the disease process. What we propose is to extract that information in a measurable way. Our central hypothesis follows directly from this. As restenosis progresses, the cyclic radial strain amplitude decreases. And importantly, this change can be detected passively using a magnetoelastic sensing element. So instead of adding complex electronics, we rely on intrinsic material interactions. Now, one important aspect is distinguishing physiological variability from pathological progression. Physiological changes like heart rate or blood pressure occur over short time scales and they are reversible. Restenosis, on the other hand, evolves gradually over weeks or months. So our strategy is to focus on long-term trends, filtering out short-term fluctuations. This allows us to isolate meaningful signals from background noise. The system itself consists of four components. The Nitinol Stent acts as both a scaffold and sensing platform. A magnetoelastic element is integrated into the stent structure. An external coil generates a magnetic field, and a receiver detects the harmonic response coming from this magnetic field. All signal processing is performed outside the body, so the implant remains fully passive. The working principle is actually quite straightforward. Arterial pulsation induces cyclic strain in the stent. This strain is transmitted to the magnetoelastic element that alters its magnetic permeability, and this results in a measurable shift in the harmonic response. So effectively, we are translating mechanical deformation into a magnetic signal that can be detected externally. And this passive nature is a major advantage of this system. There is no battery, no microelectronics, and no telemetry components embedded in the implant, which means in this scenario, fewer failure modes, improved long-term reliability, and potentially a simpler regulatory pathway. Now, compared to RF-based systems, magnetoelastic sensing offers several advantages. RF systems suffer from eddy current losses in metallical structures such as nitinol materials, reduced Q factors, and significant tissue attenuation. Magnetoelastic systems operating at lower frequencies avoid many of these issues. They also provide direct coupling between mechanical strain and signal output. So from a translational perspective, they are much more robust in these applications. In terms of monitoring workflow, we first establish a baseline shortly after implantation, then we perform periodic measurements. These could be weekly or monthly, and the system analyzes the changes relative to that baseline using the trend analysis. Importantly, all computation happens externally, not inside the implant. Detection is based on sustained change rather than isolated measurements. For example, a significant drop in signal amplitude, say over 20%, combined with a consistent downward trend over time. So the system is essentially looking for the patterns of progression, not noise. So here I would like to briefly walk you through the simulation results, which were obtained using ANSYS to evaluate the mechanical feasibility of the proposed concept. Starting from top left, what you see is the overall simulation setup. We modeled the artery as a hyperelastic cylindrical structure and the stent as a super elastic nitinol framework. Pulsatile pressure conditions were applied to replicate physiological loading, so essentially we are capturing how the stent deforms dynamically within a compliant vessel environment. Now, moving to the right top side, these contour plots show the strain distribution along the stent for different levels of occlusion. At low occlusion, around 10%, the strain distribution is relatively uniform, as you see here, which indicates that the vessel is still complete. However, as we increase the occlusion to about 40% in this case, you can clearly see that the strain pattern becomes more localized and overall deformation is reduced. This is a direct consequence of increased local stiffness due to neointimal growth. If we then look at the bottom left graph, this gives us a more quantitative perspective. There is a clear inverse relationship between lumen occlusion and cyclic radial strain amplitude. What is particularly important here is that the decline actually starts at relatively low levels for occlusions, around 15 to 20%, which suggests that the system is sensitive to early stage change, not just advanced stenosis. Finally, in the bottom right panel, we zoom into the stent structure to highlight localized effects. The dashed regions indicate where restenosis is introduced, and you can see that the strain attenuation is spatially confined to that region. So the response is not only sensitive, but also spatially relevant, which is quite promising in terms of detecting and potentially localizing the lesion development. So overall, these simulation results support the core hypothesis quite well. They show that progressive occlusion leads to measurable reductions in cyclic strain, and this mechanical signature emerges early enough to be useful for predictive monitoring. For validation, we propose a two-phase approach. First, in vitro testing using controlled pulsatile flow systems, then preclinical studies in large animal models with histological validation. The goal is to establish a strong correlation between neointimal growth and compliance-related signal changes. From a regulatory standpoint, this would likely fall under Class 3 devices. However, the passive design significantly reduces the risk especially compared to active implants. There are, of course, engineering challenges such as fatigue-related interaction, magnetic noise, and anatomical variability. But each of these can be addressed through established mitigation strategies. So stepping back, this represents a shift in how we think about monitoring. This is not a diagnostic snapshot tool, it's not invasive, and it's not electronically complex. Instead, it's a continuous biomechanical monitoring platform. So to conclude, by enabling continuous monitoring of arterial compliance, we can potentially detect restenosis before symptoms develop. And in doing so, shift post-stent care from reactive intervention to predictive management. Looking forward, this approach could be extended beyond peripheral arteries into coronary applications. Thank you very much for your attention. I would be happy to take any questions or discuss potential collaborations within this work. Thank you again.